Question 51. If a deferred tax liability is not expected to be reversed in the future, how should it most likely be classified? A, as equity, B, as income, or C, as a liability. So a deferred tax liability, it's currently being classified as a liability. And essentially, if we're not expecting to reverse that in the future, what that means is we're not going to have to pay that in the future. So since we're not going to have to pay it in the future, we no longer have to classify it as a liability. So we can go ahead and rule out liability. So then now we're down to equity and income. And I think the easiest way to kind of go about this is just because we're reversing this, it's something we're not paying in the future. So it's essentially not being expensed. So it's not necessarily going to create more taxable income for us. So we can probably go ahead and choose equity. And then another way to kind of think about this too is our pretty simple balance sheet equation. So we've got assets equals liability plus equity. So if our assets are staying the same, we have nothing in here that kind of indicates that assets are changing. But we have liabilities decreasing. That means that we need to have equity increase in order to kind of offset that. So essentially what's going to happen here is this deferred tax liability is going to go into a permanent increase in the retained earnings, which will increase our equity. So we can confidently go with answer A. Question 52. John, an experienced portfolio manager, has been tracking the performance of Blue Chip Co., a leading firm in the technology sector. Blue Chip Co. has outperformed market expectations for the last several quarters, bolstering John's confidence in the company's future prospects. Despite recent industry-wide downturns and analyst reports suggesting a cooling off in the tech sector, John is convinced that Blue Chip Co. will continue to outperform based on his detailed analysis and understanding of the company's fundamentals. He disregards, I think that's going to be important here, the recent negative reports, attributing them to market overreaction. Which of the following biases is John most likely exhibiting in his analysis? So we've got A, overconfidence bias, B, confirmation bias, or C, conservatism bias. So overconfidence bias, this would be an overconfidence in John's suggesting his own abilities are fantastic and that he has some abnormal skill in like picking stocks. So that's why he's picking this stock. And there's really no indication of that. I mean, it says he's kind of going against the grain, but he does a detailed analysis and understanding of the company fundamentals. But there's nothing suggesting that he's like saying he's this superior stock picker or something like that to kind of, and that's the reason why he's picking the stock. So I think we can rule out overconfidence. Confirmation bias. So this is when we ignore bad information and place emphasis on good information, kind of confirming our choices, which I think is what we have a case of here. So we've got industry-wide downturns, so the rest of the technology sector is not doing well, and other analysts reporting cool-offs, and John is going very against the grain. And then the key word here, which we highlighted earlier, is he disregards the recent negative reports. So John is clearly kind of taking the positive information that he's getting in his detailed analysis and the past outperformance to kind of inform his decision and ignoring that bad information. So I think we can go ahead and choose B. Let's make sure we can rule out C though. Conservatism bias, this is going to be incorrect. This is a bias where we're going to be overly cautious in our decision making. And in reality, by kind of ignoring all the bad news and negative reports, we're almost doing the opposite of conservatism bias and not being cautious by ignoring those negative reports. So we'll go with B, confirmation bias. Question 53. Adam Geller is the CFO of Cube Corp and is also the chairman of the board. Board members do not have sufficient control over management because the board is not comprised of majority independent outsiders. Cube's shareholders recently accused the firm of misrepresenting its financial reports. Which of the following factors is most likely responsible for management's action of providing low-quality financial reporting? So we've got A, motivation, B, opportunity, or C, rationalization. Let's start with motivation. So motivation, why are we providing low quality financial reports? Motivation would come in the form of the CFO or other executives kind of being under pressure to hit some goals or targets in order to kind of boost the stock price and typically enhance themselves financially. And there's really no indication of that. It doesn't say anything about them needing to hit some financial goals and that being tied to the financial reporting. So I think we can cross that off. B, opportunity. So this could be our answer, and this kind of naturally occurs when around this key second sentence here. So board members do not have sufficient control over management because the board is not comprised of a majority independent outsiders. So essentially the executives are also the ones kind of overseeing the company. So they're the board and they're the executives. So because there's less oversight there, there's an opportunity there to maybe to kind of provide that low quality financial reporting and not have somebody there to like check it and call it out necessarily, who's more unbiased or independent, as they say, independent outsider board. So opportunity looks like it could be our answer. Let's make sure we can rule out C though. Rationalization. So this would be if they were justifying the low quality financial reporting based on convincing themselves of some unethical thing they were doing that's actually okay. And there's no indication of that here. So I think we can go cross that off and stick with B. The financial reporting is happening because they don't have good kind of checks and balances in place, essentially. Question 54. Under which of the following cases is the capitalization of development costs most likely prohibited? So prohibited, when is it not allowed? In the case of A, an IFRS compliant company, B, software development by a company following US GAAP, or C, the development of a life-saving drug by a company following US GAAP. So for this question, it's really just kind of important to commit this to memory, how development costs can be capitalized under IFRS and under US GAAP. So under IFRS, development costs can always be capitalized. So this is going to lead us to rule out A, an IFRS compliant company should be able to capitalize their development costs. And then GAAP does not allow it, with the exception being software development. So software development will not be prohibited, so that will not be our answer since they're using US GAAP, and software development is the exception there. And then C, the development of a life-saving drug by a company following US GAAP. This is not an exception, so we can go ahead and go with answer C, since this will be the most likely prohibited. Question 55. Calculate the number of days payable ratio if ending inventory is 5,000, sales are 12,000, cost of goods sold is 2,000, average payables are 800, and beginning inventory is 3,000. So I'm going to pull in the order of operations here and what we need to figure out. So our days payable is going to be 365 divided by purchases turnover ratio. So this is going to be our kind of end game formula that we'll be using all the way down here. But we need to figure out the purchases turnover ratio since we're not given that. So the purchases turnover ratio is going to be purchases over average payables. So we are given average payables at 800, but we'll need to calculate purchases since we are not given that. So that leads us to another formula, which is purchases will be ending inventory plus cost of goods sold, and then subtract out beginning inventory. So we are given all of these, so now we can start doing some math. We've got inventory at 5K, cost of goods sold at 2,000, and beginning inventory of 3,000. So that gives us our purchases of 4,000, and then we move that into the purchases turnover calculation, which gives us 4,000 over 800, which is 5. And then finally, we can plug that into our days payable, which is just going to be 365 divided by 5, gives us 73. So we can go with answer C. Question 56. Which of the following financial assets are least likely reported at fair value on the balance sheet? So 2 of these will be reported at fair value and 1 will not. We need to figure out what that one is. So we've got A, held for trading securities, B, held to maturity securities, or C, available for sale securities. So the main difference that we're going to be looking at in classifying these is whether the financial assets are kind of being held to make some type of profit or whether they're just being held to maturity. So if we're holding to try and make some kind of trade or profit, they're going to be classified as held for trading or available for sale. And in this instance, we will have to mark them to fair value. And kind of for that reason we just talked about, if we're potentially going to be trading or in buying and selling these types of securities, we need to know what the fair value is so that we know what we can kind of get for those securities if we're buying and selling them. So we're going to be holding those at fair value, which will rule out A and C. It leaves us with held to maturity securities, which are allowed to be held at amortized cost. And that's because of the intent. So the intent of held to maturity is just that. We're holding them to maturity. We're not selling them. And it kind of makes sense from a conceptual standpoint if you think about it. If I'm an individual investor and I buy a bond and it's redeeming at $1,000 in 1 year, let's say, if I'm planning on holding that to maturity, then really it's worth $1,000 to me in a year, whether the price is $900 right now or $1,100. The price really doesn't matter if my intent is to hold it to maturity and just collect my $1,000 at maturity. So we'll go with B. Question 57. When determining the fair value of an asset, which factor is least likely to be considered under IFRS fair value measurement principles? So we're looking for 2 of these to be fair value measurement principles that IFRS would use and 1 that is not. So we've got A, historical cost of acquiring the asset, B, the expected future cash flows from the asset, or C, current market conditions affecting the asset's price. So when we're determining fair value, basically we want to know what the value is today. So looking at A, the historical cost of acquiring the asset is probably going to be the least accurate of those 3 because we don't know when that asset was acquired, if it was acquired 20 or 30 or 50 years ago. If you were looking at like a piece of real estate or something, that historical cost is going to be totally irrelevant to the current market conditions and what the fair value of that financial asset is. So I think we can probably go ahead and choose A for our answer, but let's look at B and C, make sure we can rule them out. So expected future cash flows of the asset, this is basically going to be a cash flows method for valuing an asset. So based on using real estate as an example, based on the income that you're receiving from some property type, how could we use that to determine what somebody would buy for that asset based on the current cap rates in the market and stuff like that. So we can rule out B since that is something we consider. And then C, current market conditions affecting the asset's price. Continuing to use real estate as an example, this would be something like using comparable transactions. So understanding what other transactions have occurred in the market and then using that to kind of determine market conditions and what your comparable asset could sell for. That's certainly a good way to kind of find out the fair value of the asset. So we will stick with A, historical cost, as the least likely to be considered. Regarding the financial statement analysis framework, a visit to the production facilities is most likely required in which of the following phases? A, collection of input data, B, the interpretation of the process data, or C, developing and communicating conclusions and recommendations. So looking at C right away, visiting the production facility is probably going to come far before we're developing and communicating conclusions and recommendations. This is going to be the last step in the process. And we're likely going to be getting some pretty vital information out of these visits. So I think we can go ahead and rule off C right away. So looking at B and A, this is a tough question, but it's going to end up falling under A, collection of input data. Because this visit is going to give us some type of data. And it's going to be considered under the collection of input data. And we're going to be using this information to kind of interpret for the interpretation step. So we can go ahead and rule out B. I think this is tricky because it's not necessarily hard data gathering. We're visiting the production facility to kind of better understand things from more of a qualitative or an operational perspective, not necessarily kind of collect hard data, which I think is what we normally think of as this collection of input data. But even if it's not hard data, it's still going to be information that kind of informs that interpretation and our conclusions in the end. So answer A. Question 59. Which of the following is least likely to be true about impairment reversals under IFRS? So we got A, impairment reversals are allowed for identifiable long-lived assets. So that we can rule this out since this is true. Under IFRS, impairment reversals are allowed for long-lived assets. B, impairment reversals can be recognized above the original carrying amount. So I think this is going to be our answer. So we are allowed to do these reversals, but recognize them above the original carrying amount is not going to be allowed under IFRS. So you would basically only be able to mark it up to the original amount that you were carrying that. C, impairment reversals are recognized if the recoverable amount of the asset increases. So again, we can rule that out since that is going to be allowed under IFRS. Answer B. Question 60. Layout Works is a printing press that takes 25 days to settle its payments. Customers take an average of 10 days to pay layout. Given that the average cash conversion cycle of the printing industry is 110 days, the firm's estimated days of inventory on hand is closest to. So we're going to be using the cash conversion cycle formula, and basically we are given the industry cash conversion cycle, so we can plug that in as 110, and then we're given days sales outstanding, which is going to be our 10. Customers take an average of 10 days to pay layout. And then our DIO, days of inventory on hand, that's what we're going to be solving for. And then we have 25 days as our days outstanding payables, or number of days payables. So we can basically just plug all these in. So we get 110 equals 10 plus days inventory outstanding, which is what we'll solve for, minus 25. So we're going to move all these over here. So we're going to have 110 minus 10 plus 25 gives us a days of inventory on hand of 125. Answer C.